Picture a 19-year-old girl in mud-caked boots and faded overalls, kneeling beside a weathered wooden table covered in yellowed documents and antique maps, while wealthy summer residents mock her desperate treasure hunting fantasies and film her humiliation for social media. They had no idea that Emma Catherine Winters, granddaughter of a Depression-era farmer and niece of a decorated Vietnam veteran, was holding an authentic 1934 hand-drawn map created by Bonnie Parker herself that would lead to the discovery of $45 million in stolen bank money and prove that sometimes the most extraordinary treasures are hidden in the most ordinary places. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Sawyer County, Wisconsin, like a shroud over secrets that had been buried for nearly a century. Emma Catherine Winters stood on the sagging front porch of her great-uncle's cabin, watching the sun burn through the fog that rose from Whitewater Lake below. At 19, she possessed the kind of quiet determination that came from generations of farmers who had learned to coax life from stubborn soil and make do with whatever resources they could scrape together. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature gray that she'd inherited from her grandmother, was pulled back in a practical braid that kept it away from her face during the long hours she spent hunched over historical documents and faded photographs. Cabin itself looked like something time had forgotten to demolish. Built in 1928 by her great-uncle Samuel Winters, it perched on a bluff overlooking the lake with the precarious dignity of a structure that had survived 9 decades through sheer stubbornness rather than proper maintenance. The logs were weathered to the color of old bones, and the metal roof bore patches of rust that mapped the passage of countless Wisconsin winters. But Emma saw past the decay to the bones of something solid, something that had sheltered 3 generations of her family through the Great Depression, World War II, and all the smaller catastrophes that had tested rural communities across the upper Midwest. Samuel Winters had been a man of few words and many secrets. A veteran of the Pacific Theater who'd returned from Guadalcanal with shrapnel in his left leg and stories he never told. He'd spent 47 years working the night shift at the paper mill in Rhinelander while maintaining this cabin as his sanctuary. Emma's father, Marcus, had always described Uncle Samuel as eccentric, a man who collected old newspapers, Depression-era photographs, and what most people dismissed as historical junk. When Samuel died 6 months ago at the age of 94, he'd left the cabin and its contents to Emma with a handwritten note that simply read, "The girl who listens to old stories deserves to know the true ones." Emma had been the only family member who'd shown genuine interest in Samuel's tales of the old days. While her cousins rolled their eyes at family gatherings whenever the old man started talking about the gangsters and bank robbers who'd once haunted the backroads of Wisconsin, Emma had listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that history lived in the details others found boring. She'd spent countless summer afternoons on this very porch, absorbing Samuel's stories about the desperate years when honest farmers had sometimes cheered for the outlaws who thumbed their noses at the banks that were foreclosing on family homesteads. Winters Family Farm, 30 miles south in Polk County, had been struggling for as long as Emma could remember. Her parents, Marcus and Linda, worked 16-hour days just to keep the dairy operation afloat against the relentless pressure of corporate agriculture and fluctuating milk prices. The farm that had supported 2 generations of Winters families now barely generated enough income to cover the mortgage payments and equipment loans that mounted like snowdrifts in a Wisconsin winter. Emma's college fund had been sacrificed to a new milking system 3 years ago, and her dreams of studying history at the University of Wisconsin had been quietly shelved alongside other luxuries her family couldn't afford. But Emma had inherited more than just her great-uncle's cabin. She'd inherited his passion for the past and his belief that history held secrets worth discovering. The cabin's interior was a testament to Samuel's obsession with the 1930s, its walls lined with framed newspaper clippings about bank robberies, FBI manhunts, and the desperate characters who'd carved their names into American folklore with bullets and banknotes. Most visitors dismissed the collection as the harmless hobby of an old man who'd watched too many gangster movies. But Emma had always sensed something more deliberate in the way Samuel had organized his materials. The discovery that would change. Everything had happened on a Thursday morning in late August, exactly 3 weeks after Emma had begun the overwhelming task of sorting through Samuel's accumulated possessions. She'd been working methodically through a roll-top desk that occupied the cabin's main room, cataloging documents for the estate lawyer, when her fingers encountered something unusual behind one of the small drawers. The hidden compartment had been invisible until she'd removed the drawer completely, revealing a space just large enough to hold a manila envelope that bore her name in Samuel's careful handwriting. Inside the envelope, she'd found a collection of items that defied easy explanation. There was a letter addressed to her in Samuel's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. There were 3 black and white photographs that appeared to show the same young woman in different poses, her fashionable 1930s clothing, and defiant expression suggesting someone who lived outside the boundaries of conventional society. But most intriguingly, there was a hand-drawn map on aged paper that showed roads, landmarks, and geographic features that Emma recognized as the area around Sawyer County, though rendered with the kind of careful detail that spoke of someone who'd needed to navigate these back roads under circumstances where getting lost could mean the difference between freedom and capture. Samuel's letter had been brief but electrifying. Emma, if you're reading this, then you're the one who needs to know what I've kept secret for 73 years. The woman in the photographs is Bonnie Parker. She gave me this map in October 1934. 6 months after the FBI claimed she and Clyde were killed in Louisiana. The map leads to money from the Merchants National Bank job in Brainerd, Minnesota. They buried it before the heat got too intense. Bonnie made me promise to wait until everyone involved was dead before telling anyone. Now they are, and I'm about to be. The treasure is real, Emma. But be careful who you trust with this information. Some secrets are worth killing for, even after all these years. Emma had spent the next 2 weeks researching everything she could find about Bonnie and Clyde, the infamous bank robbers whose crime spree had terrorized the Midwest in the early 1930s. The official FBI story was well documented. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow had been killed in an ambush in Louisiana on May 23, 1934. Their bullet-riddled bodies displayed for photographers who'd turned their deaths into a media spectacle. But Emma's research had revealed inconsistencies in the official narrative, witness accounts that didn't quite align with the FBI's version of events, and persistent rumors among law enforcement historians that the federal agents might have killed the wrong couple in their eagerness to end the manhunt. The map itself was a masterpiece of practical cartography, drawn with the precision of someone who understood that lives depended on accuracy. It showed not just roads and landmarks, but also the locations of sheriff's departments, known federal safe houses, and what appeared to be alternative routes that would allow someone to move through the region while avoiding law enforcement checkpoints. Most significantly, it marked a specific location near the headwaters of the Yellow River, about 15 miles northeast of the cabin, with a symbol that looked like a combination of Bonnie's initials and what might have been a stylized $sign. Emma had driven to the location 3 times, each visit revealing more details that supported the map's authenticity. The terrain matched perfectly with the topographical features shown on the hand-drawn document, and she'd found evidence of old-growth trees that had been marked with symbols that corresponded to notations on the map. Most convincingly, she'd discovered the remnants of what appeared to be a Depression-era campsite, hidden in a grove of oak trees that provided natural concealment from the dirt road that passed a quarter-mile to the south. But her excitement about the discovery had been tempered by the reaction she'd received when she'd tried to share her findings with others. The summer residents who owned expensive lake homes around Whitewater Lake had dismissed her as a delusional farm girl who'd been reading too many pulp novels. The local sheriff, a man named Bradley Morrison, whose family had owned the largest resort on the lake for 3 generations, had listened to her story with the kind of patronizing attention that adults reserved for children who claimed to have seen monsters under their beds. The most crushing response had come from the Sawyer County Historical Society, where Emma had hoped to find serious historians who might be interested in evaluating her discovery. Dr. Stephanie Holbrook, the Society's president and a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Superior, had examined Emma's materials with obvious skepticism before delivering a verdict that felt like a physical blow. Miss Winters, I understand that you've recently lost your great-uncle, and that you're probably feeling some financial pressure regarding your family's farm. These kinds of treasure-hunting fantasies are actually quite common among people who are dealing with economic stress. The map is interesting as a piece of folk art, but the idea that Bonnie and Clyde survived their 1934 deaths and buried treasure in northern Wisconsin is simply not supported by historical evidence. The dismissal had been delivered with the kind of academic condescension that made Emma feel like a naive child who'd confused fairy tales with reality. Dr. Holbrook had gone on to explain that the Historical Society couldn't waste resources investigating what she termed amateur theories based on family legends and questionable documentation. The photographs of Bonnie Parker, she'd suggested, were probably just pictures of an unknown woman who bore a superficial resemblance to the famous outlaw, while the map was likely a piece of creative fiction created by Emma's great-uncle during his later years, when age might have affected his ability to distinguish between memory and imagination. The rejection had been made more painful by the presence of other visitors to the Historical Society that day, including several members of the Holbrook family who owned the most expensive properties on Whitewater Lake. Emma had overheard their whispered conversations as she'd left the building. Comments about desperate farm families and treasure hunting. Delusions that revealed the class divide that separated year-round residents from the wealthy, summer people who treated the area like their personal playground. Word of Emma's claims had spread quickly through the small community that surrounded Whitewater Lake, generating the kind of gossip that rural areas seem to specialize in. By the time she'd returned to her family's farm that evening, her mother had already received phone calls from neighbors who'd heard various versions of the story, most of them distorted by the kind of exaggeration that turned genuine historical research into something resembling a conspiracy theory. "Emma, honey," her mother had said with the gentle concern that preceded difficult conversations, "people are saying you think you found some kind of treasure map. Mrs. Peterson called to ask if you were feeling all right, and the Johnsons wanted to know if we thought you might need to talk to someone about dealing with Uncle Samuel's death." The implication was clear. The community had decided that Emma's historical discovery was actually a symptom of grief-induced fantasy, a young woman's desperate attempt to find meaning and financial salvation in the aftermath of loss. The narrative was convenient for everyone involved, allowing them to dismiss her claims without the uncomfortable necessity of taking them seriously enough to investigate. Emma had spent the past week enduring the kind of small-town scrutiny that felt like being examined under a microscope. Conversations stopped when she entered the local diner, replaced by the kind of whispered discussions that made her feel like a curiosity rather than a person. The summer residents who frequented the lake had begun treating her discovery as entertainment, pointing her out to their friends and family members as the local girl who'd convinced herself that she'd found pirate treasure. Standing on the cabin's porch this morning, Emma felt the weight of isolation that came from possessing knowledge that nobody else was willing to validate. The map remained spread across her great-uncle's desk, its careful lines and symbols representing either the key to financial freedom or the product of an old man's imagination. The photographs of Bonnie Parker seemed to stare back at her with the defiant expression of someone who'd lived outside society's rules. while Samuel's letter remained as the only testimony to support claims that everyone else had dismissed as impossible. But Emma had inherited more than just her great-uncle's obsession with the past. She'd inherited the stubborn determination that had sustained her family through 3 generations of hardship, the kind of quiet persistence that enabled people to continue working toward goals that others might consider hopeless. The wealthy, summer residents who mocked her treasure-hunting fantasies had never needed to fight for anything more challenging than a good table at the country club. They'd never understood what it meant to see opportunity where others saw only problems, to find hope in situations that appeared desperate to people who'd never learned to make something from nothing. The morning sun had burned away the last of the mist, revealing the full expanse of Whitewater Lake and the expensive homes that lined its shores like monuments to inherited wealth. Emma knew that the next few hours would determine whether her great-uncle's secret would remain hidden for another generation, or whether she'd have the courage to pursue a discovery that could change not just her family's financial situation, but her understanding of history itself. As she turned to go back inside the cabin, Emma caught sight of a black SUV pulling into the narrow driveway that led to the property. The vehicle looked expensive and out of place among the modest fishing boats and pickup trucks that typically traveled the rural roads around the lake. Through the windshield, she could see 2 men in suits, their appearance suggesting either law enforcement or the kind of professional investigators that wealthy families sometimes employed to handle delicate situations. The sight of the vehicle sent a chill through Emma's chest as she realized that her great-uncle's warnings about being careful who she trusted might have been more prescient than she'd understood. Samuel had lived through an era when the wrong word to the wrong person could mean the difference between safety and danger, and his caution about keeping secrets might have been based on experience rather than paranoia. As the SUV's doors opened and the 2 men stepped out, Emma clutched the map a little tighter and prepared to discover whether her great-uncle's treasure was worth the kind of attention that some people were willing to kill for. The 2 men who emerged from the black SUV looked like they'd stepped out of a corporate boardroom rather than driven down a rutted Wisconsin dirt road. The driver was tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Emma's family spent on groceries in 3 months. His companion appeared younger, maybe in his 30s, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of personal trainers and expensive grooming. Both men surveyed the weathered cabin with expressions that mixed amusement with barely concealed disdain. "Miss Winters?" the older man called out, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Harrison Blackwood, and this is my associate, Derek Castellano. We represent certain interests that have become concerned about the stories you've been telling around the county." Emma's grip tightened on the porch railing as she recognized the name. Harrison Blackwood owned the largest and most expensive resort complex on Whitewater Lake, a sprawling compound of luxury cabins and amenities that catered to wealthy families from Chicago and Minneapolis who came north to escape the summer heat. His property encompassed nearly 2 miles of prime lakefront, and his influence extended far beyond the hospitality industry into local politics and regional development projects. "I'm not sure what stories you're referring to," Emma replied, though her voice betrayed the nervousness she felt at being confronted by men whose resources and connections made her feel vulnerable in ways she was only beginning to understand. Derek Castellano pulled out a tablet and began scrolling through what appeared to be social media posts and local news articles. "Stories about treasure maps and bank robbers, Miss Winters. Claims that you've discovered evidence of missing money from Depression-era crimes. The kind of sensational nonsense that can damage our community's reputation as a serious destination for discerning visitors." The accusation hit Emma like a physical blow. She'd never considered that her historical research might be viewed as a threat to the tourist industry that provided the economic foundation for much of Sawyer County's service economy. The wealthy summer residents who owned properties around the lake represented millions of dollars in annual spending, and their continued investment in the area depended on maintaining its image as a peaceful retreat rather than a location associated with criminal activity. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I haven't told any stories. I'm researching my family's history based on documents I found in my great-uncle's belongings. If you're concerned about something specific, maybe you could explain what that is." Harrison Blackwood's smile was the kind that predators used to put their prey at ease before striking. Miss Winters were concerned about the impact that wild treasure hunting claims might have on property values and tourism revenue. When people start talking about buried money and gangster hideouts, it creates exactly the kind of sensational atmosphere that drives away the quality clientele our community depends on. Derek Castellano had positioned himself to record their conversation, his tablet capturing both Emma's responses and the general appearance of the property. The documentation felt invasive and threatening, as if they were building a case against her rather than simply expressing concerns about community reputation. "I'm not treasure hunting," Emma protested, though even as she said it, she realized how her research might appear to people who didn't understand the historical significance of her discovery. "I'm trying to verify historical documents that might shed new light on events from the 1930s. That's legitimate historical research, not some kind of get-rich-quick scheme." Blackwood's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "Historical research? Miss Winters, you're 19 years old with a high school education and no formal training in historical methodology. What you're doing is spreading unsubstantiated rumors that could seriously damage our community's carefully cultivated image." The attack on her qualifications stung more than Emma had expected. She'd always been proud of her self-directed education, the countless hours she'd spent reading about Wisconsin history and the careful research she'd conducted into Depression-era criminal activity. But when confronted by men whose wealth and connections gave them automatic credibility, her autodidactic approach suddenly felt amateur and inadequate. "Furthermore," Derek Castellano added, consulting his tablet with the air of someone presenting damning evidence, "we've learned that your family's farm is currently behind on loan payments and facing potential foreclosure. It's understandable that someone in your financial situation might be tempted to create sensational stories that could attract media attention or even reality television producers." The invasion of her family's privacy felt like a violation that went far beyond legitimate concern about community reputation. The fact that these men had investigated her family's financial situation suggested resources and determination that transformed their visit from casual intimidation into something that felt genuinely threatening. "How dare you investigate my family's private business," Emma said, her voice rising with anger that overcame her initial nervousness. "What gives you the right to dig into our financial records?" Harrison Blackwood stepped closer to the porch, his physical presence designed to reinforce the power imbalance that already dominated their interaction. "Miss Winters, when someone starts making claims that could affect property values worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it becomes everyone's business to understand their motivations and credibility." Derek Castellano had moved to capture video of the cabin's exterior, focusing on details that emphasized its rundown condition and the general appearance of poverty that surrounded Emma's living situation. The documentation felt like evidence being gathered for some kind of prosecution, though Emma couldn't understand what crime she might have committed by researching her family's history. "This is what we're dealing with," Derek said, speaking directly to his tablet's camera as if addressing an audience that would view the recording later. "A financially desperate teenager living in a cabin that should probably be condemned, making wild claims about finding treasure maps that supposedly belong to famous criminals. It's textbook fantasy behavior from someone who's clearly struggling with the reality of her family's economic situation." The clinical assessment of her psychological state was delivered with the kind of professional detachment that made Emma feel like a specimen being examined rather than a person deserving basic respect. These men had arrived with predetermined conclusions about her character and motivations, and nothing she could say would alter their narrative of desperate delusion. "You're recording this without my permission," Emma said, recognizing that her privacy was being violated in ways that might have legal implications. "I want you to leave my property immediately." Blackwood's expression shifted to mock sympathy, the kind of condescending concern that adults often directed toward children who were having emotional difficulties. "Miss Winters, we're not trying to embarrass you or cause you additional stress. We're simply trying to document the source of rumors that could seriously damage our community's reputation and economic stability." Derek continued his video documentation, capturing footage of Emma's defensive posture and obvious distress while providing commentary that painted her as an unstable young woman whose fantasies were being driven by financial desperation. "As you can see, Miss Winters is clearly emotionally invested in her treasure hunting claims, despite the lack of any credible evidence to support them." The humiliation of being recorded while in emotional distress was made worse by the knowledge that this footage would likely be shared with others, possibly posted online where it could be viewed by anyone interested in her story. Emma realized that she was being transformed from a serious historical researcher into a figure of public ridicule, her claims dismissed and her character questioned in ways that would be difficult to overcome. "The historical documents I found are real," Emma said, though her voice lacked the confidence she'd felt just hours earlier. "The photographs, the map, my great-uncle's letter explaining what happened, it's all authentic evidence that deserves serious investigation." Derek Castellano zoomed in on Emma's face as she made her claims, capturing the desperation in her voice and the tears that had begun forming in her eyes. "Miss Winters continues to insist that her supposed evidence is authentic, despite the obvious financial incentives she has to create sensational stories that might attract outside attention or investment. The suggestion that she was deliberately fabricating evidence for financial gain felt like the cruelest accusation yet." Emma had never considered the possibility that her research might be viewed as a calculated attempt to attract money or media attention, rather than genuine historical investigation based on family documents that had been hidden for decades. Harrison Blackwood consulted his expensive watch with the theatrical gesture of someone whose time was too valuable to waste on extended conversations with people he considered beneath his notice. "Miss Winters, we're going to give you an opportunity to resolve this situation quietly and with minimal embarrassment to yourself or your family." The offer sounded ominous rather than generous, carrying implications that Emma didn't fully understand but instinctively feared. Men with Blackwood's resources and connections didn't make casual offers to people they considered problems. They made ultimatums disguised as reasonable compromises. "What kind of opportunity?" Emma asked, though she suspected that whatever they were about to propose would require her to abandon her research and accept their narrative of delusional treasure hunting. Derek lowered his tablet long enough to make direct eye contact with Emma, his expression carrying the kind of calculated friendliness that preceded the delivery of threats. "We're prepared to help your family with their current financial difficulties. A private loan that could prevent the foreclosure of your farm and give you the resources to pursue legitimate educational opportunities rather than wasting time on historical fantasies." The offer was presented as generosity, but Emma recognized it as attempted bribery designed to buy her silence and compliance. These men were willing to solve her family's financial problems in exchange for her agreement to stop researching the documents she'd found in her great-uncle's cabin. "In return," Harrison Blackwood continued, "you would simply need to acknowledge publicly that your treasure hunting claims were based on misunderstanding family stories and amateur historical research. A simple statement that would put this entire unfortunate episode behind us." The quid pro quo was clear. financial salvation for her family in exchange for public humiliation and the abandonment of research that might represent the most significant historical discovery of her lifetime. Emma would be required to portray herself as a naive young woman who'd confused family legends with historical fact, saving face for the wealthy interests who were concerned about property values and tourism revenue. "And if I refuse?" Emma asked, though she suspected that people with Blackwood's resources rarely accepted refusal as a final answer. Derek raised his tablet again, preparing to record her response to what was clearly intended as a final offer. "Then we'll be forced to take steps to protect our community's interests and reputation. The footage we've gathered today documents concerning behavior from someone whose financial desperation has clearly affected her judgment. Mental health professionals might need to be consulted, and social services might need to evaluate whether you're receiving appropriate family support during this difficult time." The threat was delivered with legal precision, using language that avoided explicit intimidation, while making clear that rejection of their offer would result in consequences that could extend far beyond simple embarrassment. Emma realized that she was facing people who possessed the resources and connections to make her life extremely difficult if she continued pursuing research they viewed as threatening to their interests. "You're threatening me," Emma said, though her voice carried more disbelief than anger. She'd never imagined that historical research could generate the kind of opposition that wealthy people were willing to deploy against a teenager whose only crime was taking family documents seriously. Harrison. Blackwood's smile was cold and professional, the expression of someone who delivered similar ultimatums to other people who'd threatened his interests. "Miss Winters, we're offering you assistance and guidance during what is clearly a difficult period in your life. The choice of how to respond to that offer is entirely yours." Derek Castellano had positioned his tablet to capture Emma's final response, creating a permanent record of a young woman being forced to choose between family financial security and historical research that nobody else was willing to validate. The footage would serve as documentation of her decision. Whether she chose compliance or defiance, Emma looked past the two men toward the lake where expensive boats carried wealthy summer residents across water that had once hidden the secrets of people desperate enough to steal money and bury it in places where only death could reveal its location. Her great-uncle had waited 73 years to share his secret, trusting that the right person would eventually understand its significance and have the courage to pursue truth regardless of the obstacles placed in their path. "I need time to think about your offer," Emma said finally, recognizing that immediate refusal might provoke the kind of retaliation that could destroy her family's livelihood before she had an opportunity to prove the authenticity of her discovery. "Harrison." Blackwood nodded with satisfaction, apparently interpreting her request for time as evidence that his intimidation had been effective. "Of course, Miss Winters. These are important decisions that shouldn't be made hastily. We'll give you 48 hours to consider our offer and discuss it with your family." Derek Castellano lowered his tablet and prepared to return to the SUV, his documentation complete and his assessment of Emma's psychological state recorded for whatever purposes they intended to use it. "Miss Winters, I hope you'll make the decision that's best for everyone involved, including yourself and your family." As the black SUV disappeared down the dirt road, Emma realized that her great-uncle's warning about being careful who she trusted had been more prophetic than she'd understood. The wealthy interests that controlled her community were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect their version of local history, even if it meant suppressing evidence that might reveal truths about the past that they found inconvenient or threatening. Standing alone on the cabin's porch, Emma felt the weight of isolation that came from possessing knowledge that powerful people were determined to discredit or suppress. But she also felt the stubborn determination that had sustained her family through generations of hardship, the same quality that had enabled her great-uncle to keep dangerous secrets for 73 years while waiting for someone brave enough to pursue them. The map remained spread across Samuel's desk, its careful lines and symbols representing either the key to historical vindication or the source of opposition that could destroy everything her family had worked to build. But Emma had inherited more than just documents and photographs. She'd inherited the responsibility to honor her great-uncle's trust and the courage to pursue truth regardless of the cost. The first sign that Harrison Blackwood's 48-hour deadline was more than an idle threat came at 6:30 the following morning when Emma's mother received a phone call from the Sawyer County Department of Social Services. Linda Winters stood in the farmhouse kitchen, still wearing her bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold, while she listened to a caseworker explain that they'd received concerns about a family member who might be experiencing psychological distress following the death of a relative. "Mrs. Winters, I'm Rachel Martinez from the County Social Services Office," the voice on the phone explained with professional sympathy. "We've received reports that your daughter Emma might be struggling to cope with recent losses and may be engaging in concerning behaviors that suggest she could benefit from mental health evaluation and support services." Emma watched her mother's face transform from confusion to anger as the implications of the call became clear. Someone with enough influence to mobilize government agencies had decided that Emma's historical research represented a mental health crisis requiring official intervention. The weaponization of social services against families who lacked the resources to fight back was a tactic that revealed the ruthless efficiency of wealth when applied to suppress inconvenient truths. "What kind of concerning behaviors are you talking about?" Linda asked, her voice tight with the controlled fury of a mother whose child was being attacked by people she'd never met. Emma is a responsible young woman who's been helping manage family finances and taking care of her great-uncle's estate since his death. Rachel Martinez consulted what sounded like extensive documentation, her tone suggesting the kind of thorough investigation that typically preceded serious interventions. "We've received reports that Emma has been making claims about finding treasure maps and communicating with deceased relatives through historical documents. Additionally, there are concerns about her spending extended periods alone in an isolated cabin while engaging in obsessive research behaviors that may indicate difficulty processing grief." The clinical language transformed Emma's dedicated historical research into symptoms of psychological dysfunction, her careful documentation of family artifacts into evidence of concerning obsessive behavior. The narrative had been crafted with the precision of people who understood exactly how to manipulate social service protocols to achieve their desired outcomes. Marcus Winters had entered the kitchen during the conversation, and Emma watched her father's expression shift from morning drowsiness to the kind of protective anger that farming families reserve for threats to their children. He gestured for the phone, and Linda handed it over with obvious reluctance. "This is Marcus Winters," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bureaucratic interference in family affairs. "I want to know exactly who filed these reports and what evidence they provided to support their claims about my daughter's mental health." There was a pause during which Rachel Martinez apparently consulted additional documentation before responding with the careful neutrality that government employees used when discussing sensitive investigations. "Mr. Winters, I can't reveal the specific sources of our reports due to confidentiality requirements, but I can tell you that we've received concerns from multiple community members who've had interactions with Emma and observed behaviors that they felt warranted professional evaluation." The reference to multiple community members suggested a coordinated campaign rather than spontaneous concern from neighbors who genuinely worried about Emma's well-being. Harrison Blackwood and his associates had apparently spent the night mobilizing their network of connections to create the appearance of widespread community concern about Emma's psychological state. "What kind of behaviors?" Marcus demanded, his farmer's pragmatism cutting through bureaucratic euphemisms to demand specific information. "My daughter is grieving the loss of her great-uncle. But she's also conducting legitimate research into family history using documents she inherited. That's not mental illness. That's normal behavior for someone who cares about understanding her family's past. Rachel Martinez's response revealed the sophistication of the case that had been built against Emma overnight. Mr. Winters, we've received reports that Emma has been making public claims about finding evidence of criminal activity from the 1930s, including assertions that famous historical figures may have been involved in activities that contradict established historical records. Additionally, witnesses have reported observing her exhibiting emotional distress when these claims were questioned by qualified professionals. The summary transformed Emma's research into delusion and her legitimate frustration with academic dismissal into evidence of psychological instability. The case had been constructed with the kind of precision that suggested legal consultation and careful coordination among multiple parties who possessed both the resources and expertise to weaponize social service protocols. "I want to see the specific reports that were filed," Marcus said, his voice growing harder as he recognized the nature of the attack his family was facing. "I want names, dates, and detailed descriptions of exactly what behaviors were supposedly observed and by whom." The request for transparency was met with the kind of procedural resistance that government agencies typically deployed when they wanted to protect the identity of people who'd made unsubstantiated accusations. "Mr. Winters, our confidentiality policies prevent me from sharing specific details about our sources, but I can schedule a meeting with you and your daughter to discuss our concerns and explore appropriate support resources." Emma had been listening to the conversation with growing recognition that her decision to pursue her great-uncle's secret had triggered retaliation that extended far beyond simple social pressure. The people who opposed her research possessed the connections and resources to transform her historical investigation into a mental health crisis that could justify forced intervention and potentially remove her ability to continue her work. "We don't need support resources," Marcus said firmly. "What we need is for you to explain why County Social Services is investigating a teenager whose only crime is taking her family's history seriously." But even as her father defended her, Emma could see the doubt beginning to creep into her parents' expressions. The official involvement of social services carried the weight of governmental authority, and the clinical language used to describe her research made it sound genuinely concerning even to people who knew her well. The attack was succeeding because it used the credibility of official institutions to validate accusations that would have been dismissed if they'd come from obviously biased sources. The phone call ended with Rachel Martinez scheduling a mandatory meeting for the following day, her tone suggesting that the Winters family's cooperation wasn't actually optional, despite the polite language used to frame the request. Emma realized that she had less than 24 hours before she would be forced to submit to psychological evaluation by professionals who'd already been provided with a narrative that painted her research as evidence of mental illness. Morning's second crisis arrived with the mail delivery at 9:15. When Emma discovered that the Sawyer County Historical Society had filed a formal complaint with the Wisconsin Historical Preservation Board, alleging that she was making fraudulent claims about historical artifacts and spreading misinformation that could damage the academic reputation of legitimate historical research in the region, Dr. Stephanie Holbrook's signature appeared at the bottom of a 3-page letter that systematically dismantled Emma's credibility while presenting the Historical Society as the victim of harassment by an unstable young woman whose grief had manifested in elaborate fantasies about famous criminals. The complaint requested that the State Historical Board investigate Emma's claims and take appropriate action to prevent further spread of what Holbrook termed dangerous pseudo-historical mythology. The letter described Emma's research in language that made it sound like deliberate fraud rather than genuine investigation based on inherited family documents. Miss Winters has been making increasingly grandiose claims about possessing authentic artifacts from the Bonnie and Clyde crime spree, despite the obvious impossibility of such materials existing in the hands of a private individual with no credentials or institutional affiliation. Her insistence on the authenticity of clearly fabricated materials represents the kind of historical misconduct that undermines public trust in legitimate academic research. Emma had never presented her materials as definitively authentic. She'd simply requested professional evaluation to determine their legitimacy. But Dr. Holbrook's complaint transformed her reasonable request for expert analysis into evidence of delusional behavior and deliberate deception. The academic establishment was being weaponized against her, just as effectively as social services had been mobilized to question her mental health. The complaint went on to describe Emma's emotional response to academic skepticism as evidence of psychological instability rather than legitimate frustration with dismissive treatment. When presented with professional analysis that questioned the authenticity of her supposed artifacts, Miss Winters became agitated and made personal attacks against qualified historians whose expertise she lacks the education to evaluate. This behavior pattern suggests someone whose emotional investment in maintaining false narratives has overcome their ability to accept objective evidence. Emma realized that every interaction she'd had with professional historians was being reinterpreted through a lens that portrayed her passion for her research as pathological behavior. Her dedication to understanding her family's history had been transformed into obsessive delusion, while her frustration with academic dismissal had become evidence of dangerous instability. The complaint concluded with a request that carried the weight of institutional authority. The Wisconsin Historical Preservation Board should investigate Miss Winters' activities and take appropriate action to prevent further spread of false historical claims that could damage public understanding of Depression-era criminal history. Additionally, we recommend that mental health professionals evaluate Miss Winters' ability to distinguish between historical fact and personal fantasy. The coordination between Dr. Holbrook's academic complaint and the social services investigation revealed the sophistication of the campaign being waged against Emma's research. Multiple institutional authorities were being mobilized simultaneously to create the appearance of widespread professional concern about her psychological state and historical credibility. By noon, Emma discovered that the attack had spread to social media platforms where her story was being transformed into entertainment for people who found amusement in watching young women suffer public humiliation. Someone had created a Facebook page called Sawyer County Treasure Hunter that featured photographs of Emma taken without her permission, alongside mocking commentary about rural poverty and educational inadequacy. The page's content revealed intimate knowledge of Emma's family's financial situation, her academic background, and her personal history in ways that suggested access to private information that should have been protected by confidentiality laws. The posts included photographs of the Winters family farm that emphasized its rundown condition, alongside commentary that portrayed Emma's research as the desperate fantasy of someone whose family was facing financial ruin. This is what happens when poor kids watch too much History Channel, read one post that had been shared hundreds of times. Emma Winters thinks she's found treasure maps in her dead uncle's junk collection. Reality check. You're not Indiana Jones, sweetie. You're just a farm girl who needs to get a job instead of making up stories about gangsters. The comment section revealed the cruel creativity that social media seemed to inspire when users were given opportunities to mock people they perceived as vulnerable. Emma found herself reading assessments of her appearance, her family's poverty, and her psychological state from strangers who treated her suffering as entertainment rather than recognizing her as a person deserving basic human dignity. "Look at her in that picture," one commenter had written. "She actually believes she's going to find buried treasure." This is what happens when you don't have proper education and let your imagination run wild. Someone needs to get this girl professional help before she really embarrasses herself. Another commenter had posted, My cousin lives near there and says the whole family is about to lose their farm. No wonder she's making up fantasy stories about finding money. It's actually kind of sad how desperate some people get when they're facing reality. The transformation of her research into public entertainment was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the campaign against her. Emma's genuine historical investigation had been reframed as the desperate delusion of a mentally unstable young woman whose poverty had driven her to elaborate fantasies about financial salvation through treasure hunting. The social media page had also begun attracting the attention of actual treasure hunters and amateur historians who were arriving in Sawyer County to investigate Emma's claims for themselves. Their presence was creating exactly the kind of sensational atmosphere that Harrison Blackwood had claimed to be concerned about preventing. But Emma realized that their arrival might actually be part of the strategy designed to discredit her research. By afternoon, Emma counted at least 6 vehicles with out-of-state license plates parked along the roads near her great-uncle's cabin. Men with metal detectors and camping equipment were treating the area like a tourist destination, their enthusiastic treasure hunting creating the appearance that Emma's research had inspired a circus of amateur fortune seekers rather than legitimate historical investigation. The spectacle was being documented by Derek Castellano, who had returned with professional camera equipment to film the treasure hunters while providing commentary that portrayed the scene as evidence of the chaos that Emma's delusional claims had created in a previously peaceful community. As you can see, Derek announced to his camera while treasure hunters worked in the background, Emma Winter's treasure hunting fantasies have attracted exactly the kind of sensational attention that threatens our community's reputation as a serious destination for discerning visitors. Local residents are now dealing with trespassers, property damage, and the general disruption that comes when someone makes irresponsible claims about buried treasure. The footage would serve as evidence that Emma's research had created genuine problems for the community, providing justification for whatever legal or administrative actions might be taken to force her to abandon her investigation. The treasure hunters were creating the very disturbances that Harrison Blackwood's group could then point to as proof that Emma's activities were damaging community interests. Emma realized that she was witnessing a sophisticated campaign designed to isolate her from any sources of support while building multiple justifications for official intervention. Social services questioned her mental health, academic authorities questioned her historical credibility, and social media transformed her research into public entertainment while documented evidence accumulated to support whatever actions wealthy interests wanted to take against her. Standing in her great-uncle's cabin as sunset approached, Emma felt the weight of forces that seemed determined to prevent her from pursuing the truth about documents that might reveal inconvenient secrets about the past. But she also felt the stubborn determination that had sustained her family through generations of hardship, the same quality that had enabled Samuel Winters to keep dangerous secrets for 73 years while waiting for someone brave enough to honor his trust. The map remained spread across Samuel's desk, its careful lines and symbols representing either the key to historical vindication or the source of opposition that was systematically destroying her family's life. Emma had 24 hours before she would be forced to submit to psychological evaluation, and she realized that her next decision would determine whether her great-uncle's secret would die with the institutional pressure designed to silence inconvenient truths, or whether she would find the courage to pursue evidence that some people considered worth killing for, even after all these years. Salvation Emma hadn't dared to hope for arrived in the form of a battered Ford pickup truck that pulled into her great-uncle's driveway at 7:30 on Wednesday morning, just 4 hours before her mandatory appointment with the county social services department. The driver was a woman in her mid-60s whose silver hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail and whose weathered hands suggested decades of archival work rather than outdoor labor. She climbed out of the truck with the careful movements of someone whose joints had been worn down by years of hunching over historical documents. but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of a person who'd spent a lifetime separating truth from carefully constructed lies. "Miss Winters?" The woman called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously by people who initially underestimated her capabilities. "I'm Dr. Margaret Chun, and I believe we have some very important things to discuss about your great-uncle's collection." Emma emerged from the cabin clutching Samuel's letter, her sleep-deprived exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the tremor in her hands that came from 36 hours of constant stress. The approaching deadline for psychological evaluation had made it impossible to rest, and she'd spent the night researching legal options for resisting social services intervention while simultaneously trying to authenticate the documents that had triggered such fierce opposition. "Dr. Chun?" Emma asked, recognizing the name from academic articles she'd found during her research into Depression-era criminal history. "You wrote the paper about FBI investigative procedures in the 1930s and the inconsistencies in their Bonnie and Clyde case files." Margaret Chun's expression shifted from professional interest to genuine surprise as she realized that Emma had not only read her specialized academic work, but understood its significance well enough to recognize its relevance to her current situation. "That's exactly right, Miss Winters. And your mention of that particular paper tells me that you've been conducting far more sophisticated research than certain people have given you credit for." The validation from a legitimate academic authority felt like oxygen to someone who'd been suffocating under institutional pressure and social ridicule. Dr. Chen's recognition that Emma's research was sophisticated rather than delusional provided the first professional support she'd received since beginning her investigation into Samuel's documents. "How did you know about my research?" Emma asked, gesturing for Dr. Chun to join her on the cabin's porch where they could speak without being overheard by any surveillance that Harrison Blackwood's people might have established in the area. Margaret Chun settled into one of Samuel's weathered wooden chairs with obvious appreciation for its solid construction and practical design. "Miss Winters, I've spent 43 years working as a federal historian, first with the FBI and later as an independent researcher, specializing in unsolved cases from the 1930s. When someone starts making claims about Bonnie and Clyde artifacts that directly contradict the official narrative, word spreads quickly through the community of people who study these cases professionally." The revelation that Emma's research had attracted the attention of federal historians, rather than just local social media mockery, provided perspective on the significance of her discovery. Dr. Chun's presence suggested that Emma's documents might possess the kind of historical importance that justified serious academic investigation rather than dismissal as family folklore. "Dr. Holbrook from the County Historical Society said my materials were obviously fabricated," Emma said, her voice carrying the uncertainty that came from having her judgment questioned by people whose credentials exceeded her own. She filed a complaint with the state, saying I was spreading dangerous pseudo-historical mythology. Margaret Chun's laugh was dry and knowing, the sound of someone who'd encountered institutional resistance to inconvenient truths throughout her professional career. Stephanie Holbrook wouldn't recognize authentic Depression-era documentation if it came with a notarized certificate from J. Edgar Hoover himself. Her expertise is in Wisconsin territorial history, and she spent the last 15 years writing papers about lumber camp social structures. She has no background in federal criminal investigations or document authentication from that period. The dismissal of Dr. Holbrook's expertise by someone with genuine credentials in the relevant field provided Emma with the first clear indication that the academic opposition to her research might be based on institutional politics rather than legitimate scholarly concerns. Margaret Chun's specialized knowledge made her qualified to evaluate materials that fell outside the expertise of local historians who'd never worked with federal criminal case files. More importantly, Dr. Chun continued, Stephanie Holbrook has been receiving significant financial support from local business interests for her historical society projects. When wealthy donors express concerns about historical research that might affect their property values or tourism revenue, academic institutions sometimes find ways to discourage investigations that could prove inconvenient. The suggestion that Emma's research was being suppressed for economic, rather than scholarly reasons provided context for the coordinated campaign she'd been facing. Dr. Chen's federal background had apparently given her insight into the ways that wealthy interests could manipulate academic and governmental institutions to protect their financial concerns from inconvenient historical discoveries. Dr. Chen, Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she realized she was finally speaking with someone who understood the significance of her situation. I found documents in my great-uncle's belongings that suggest Bonnie and Clyde might have survived their supposed deaths in 1934. There's a map that shows locations in this area where they might have buried money from bank robberies. Margaret Chun leaned forward with the focused attention of someone whose professional life had been dedicated to investigating exactly these kinds of historical anomalies. Miss Winters, I've been studying the FBI's Bonnie and Clyde case files for 27 years, and I can tell you that there are significant problems with the official narrative of their deaths. The ballistics evidence doesn't match the weapons that were supposed to have been used. Witness testimonies contain inconsistencies that were never adequately explained, and several FBI agents involved in the case later made comments that suggested they had doubts about whether they'd actually killed the right people. The professional validation of Emma's research from someone with access to federal case files felt like vindication after days of having her credibility questioned by people who lacked the expertise to evaluate Depression-era criminal evidence. Dr. Chun's academic credentials and federal experience made her qualified to assess materials that local historians had dismissed without proper examination. I brought my authentication equipment, Dr. Chun said, gesturing toward a large case she'd retrieved from her truck. If you're willing to allow professional analysis of your documents, I can provide definitive answers about their age, authenticity, and historical significance. The kind of scientific evaluation that should have been done before anyone made conclusions about their validity. Emma felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized that someone was finally offering to treat her research with the seriousness it deserved rather than dismissing it based on assumptions about her age and educational background. The prospect of scientific authentication would either vindicate her great-uncle's claims or provide closure by proving that his documents were indeed family folklore rather than historical evidence. There's something you should know, Emma said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she recognized the need for caution, even when speaking with all eyes. Powerful people in this community have been trying to force me to abandon my research. They've mobilized social services, academic institutions, and social media to pressure me into admitting that my documents are fake and my research is the product of mental illness. Margaret Chun's expression hardened as she absorbed the implications of institutional pressure being applied to suppress historical research. Miss Winters, I've seen this pattern before in cases where historical discoveries threaten established narratives or powerful interests. The tactics you're describing are consistent with organized campaigns to discredit researchers who've uncovered inconvenient truths. The recognition that Emma's situation fit established patterns of institutional suppression provided confirmation that her research was significant enough to justify the extraordinary efforts being made to silence her. Dr. Chun's federal experience had apparently exposed her to similar cases where historical discoveries had generated opposition from people with sufficient resources to manipulate governmental and academic institutions. What kind of cases? Emma asked, realizing that her situation might not be unique and that other researchers had faced similar challenges when their work threatened powerful interests. Margaret Chen was quiet for a moment, her expression suggesting that she was weighing How much information to share about sensitive investigations that might still be classified or politically dangerous? Miss Winters, there are historical discoveries that remain suppressed because they would embarrass federal agencies, contradict official narratives, or threaten economic interests that have significant political influence. The FBI's Depression-era cases are particularly sensitive because they established the Bureau's reputation and because many of the wealthy families who were targeted by criminals during that period still possess considerable political power. The suggestion that Emma's research might intersect with ongoing political sensitivities provided context for the sophisticated opposition she'd been facing. If her documents contained evidence that contradicted FBI narratives from the 1930s, federal agencies might have legitimate reasons to discourage investigation that could embarrass the Bureau or reveal historical misconduct by federal agents. Dr. Chun, Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Do you think my great-uncle's documents are authentic?" Margaret Chun studied Emma's face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades interviewing witnesses and evaluating the credibility of people making extraordinary claims. Miss Winters, based on your description of the materials and the reaction they've generated from local authorities, I believe there's a strong possibility that your great-uncle possessed genuine historical artifacts. The level of institutional pressure being applied to suppress your research suggests that someone believes your documents contain information that could be damaging if it became public. The professional assessment that her research was likely legitimate provided Emma with the confidence she'd been lacking since beginning her investigation. Dr. Chun's expertise in federal criminal cases from the 1930s made her qualified to evaluate materials that local historians had dismissed without proper analysis. However, Dr. Chun continued, we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed. If your documents are authentic, they represent evidence of federal law enforcement failures that could still have political ramifications. The people trying to suppress your research may have connections that extend far beyond local business interests. The warning about potential federal implications added another layer of complexity to Emma's situation, but it also provided validation that her research was significant enough to justify the extraordinary opposition she'd been facing. Dr. Chun's federal background made her uniquely qualified to understand the political sensitivities that surrounded Depression-era criminal cases. I have an appointment with social services in 3 hours, Emma said, her voice tight with anxiety about the mandatory psychological evaluation that could result in forced treatment or removal from her family's home. They're claiming that MY research is evidence of mental illness and that I need professional intervention. Margaret Chun's expression shifted to controlled anger as she recognized the implications of using social services to suppress historical research. Miss Winters, that's a particularly insidious form of institutional abuse. Using mental health evaluations to silence researchers who've made inconvenient discoveries is a tactic that violates both academic freedom and basic civil rights. The recognition that Emma's situation represented institutional abuse rather than legitimate concern for her well-being provided clarity about the nature of the opposition she was facing. Dr. Chun's professional experience with federal investigations had apparently exposed her to similar cases where psychological evaluations had been weaponized to discredit researchers whose work threatened established interests. What can I do? Emma asked, feeling overwhelmed by forces that seemed designed to destroy her credibility and remove her ability to continue her research regardless of its historical significance. Margaret Chun opened her equipment case and began assembling what appeared to be sophisticated document analysis tools, her movements indicating familiarity with authentication procedures that required precision and specialized knowledge. First, we're going to conduct professional analysis of your documents using scientific methods that will provide definitive answers about their authenticity and historical significance. Second, I'm going to contact colleagues at the Smithsonian Institution and the National Archives, who specialize in Depression-era criminal history. The prospect of having her research evaluated by legitimate federal institutions provided hope that Emma's documents would receive the serious academic attention they deserved rather than being dismissed by local historians whose expertise didn't extend to criminal case files from the 1930s. Most importantly, Dr. Chun continued, I'm going to document everything that's happened to you as a case study in institutional suppression of historical research. The tactics being used against you represent a pattern that needs to be exposed and challenged through appropriate academic and legal channels. The commitment to documenting the institutional abuse Emma had experienced provided validation that her treatment represented something more significant than simple academic disagreement. Dr. Chun's federal background gave her the credibility and connections necessary to challenge the coordinated campaign that had been waged against Emma's research. Dr. Chun, Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she realized that she finally had an ally whose expertise and institutional connections could counter the opposition she'd been facing. There's something else you should know. My great-uncle left me a letter explaining that he kept this secret for 73 years because he was afraid of what might happen if the wrong people found out about it. Margaret Chun paused in her equipment setup and looked directly at Emma with the focused attention of someone who understood the significance of secrets that had been carefully guarded for decades. Miss Winters, if your great-uncle was involved with Bonnie and Clyde in 1934 and kept that secret for his entire adult life, it suggests that he had good reasons to fear the consequences of revealing what he knew. The fact that his documents have generated such fierce opposition nearly a century later indicates that those concerns may still be valid. The recognition that Samuel Winter's caution had been justified by subsequent events provided Emma with perspective on the dangers she was facing. Her great-uncle had apparently understood that some historical truths remained politically sensitive long after the people directly involved had died. As Dr. Chen began the scientific analysis that would determine whether Emma's research was based on authentic historical documents or elaborate family mythology, Emma felt a shift in her understanding of what was possible when researchers received support from allies whose expertise and institutional connections could counter organized opposition to inconvenient truths. The authentication process would take several hours, but for the first time since discovering her great-uncle's secret, Emma felt hope that the truth about his documents would be established through scientific methods rather than dismissed through institutional pressure designed to protect interests that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. Dr. Chun's document analysis equipment transformed Samuel's rustic cabin into something resembling a forensic laboratory. Her specialized tools casting precise beams of ultraviolet and infrared light across the aged papers that had triggered such fierce opposition from local authorities. Emma watched with growing anticipation as the federal historian conducted tests that would provide definitive answers about the authenticity of materials that had already generated attempts to destroy her family's livelihood and reputation. The first test involved spectroscopic analysis of the ink used to draw the map, a process that could determine not only the chemical composition of the writing materials but also their approximate age based on the degradation of organic compounds over time. Dr. Chun's equipment displayed readings that made her pause and double-check her measurements before sharing the results with Emma. Miss Winters, Dr. Chun said, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd just discovered something extraordinary. This ink is consistent with fountain pen formulations used between 1930 and 1940. More specifically, the iron gall ink and the paper composition match materials that would have been commonly available during the Depression era but are extremely difficult to replicate using modern manufacturing processes. The scientific confirmation that her great-uncle's map dated to the 1930s provided the first objective evidence that Samuel's claims about meeting Bonnie Parker might be historically accurate rather than family mythology. Emma felt vindication washing over her, as professional analysis validated research that local authorities had dismissed without proper investigation. Dr. Chun's examination of the photographs revealed even more compelling evidence of authenticity. The photographic paper, the chemical processing techniques, and even the clothing styles are absolutely consistent with 1934. She explained while examining the images under magnification that revealed details invisible to casual observation. But more importantly, the facial bone structure and distinctive features of the woman in these photographs match authenticated images of Bonnie Parker that are held in FBI archives. The revelation that the photographs showed genuine images of Bonnie Parker rather than an unknown woman who merely resembled the famous outlaw provided confirmation that Emma's research was based on authentic historical materials rather than elaborate hoaxes or family folklore. Dr. Chun's access to FBI photographic archives made her uniquely qualified to authenticate images that local historians had dismissed without proper comparison to official records. "There's something else," Dr. Chun continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as she recognized the sensitivity of what she was about to reveal. The FBI's official photographs of Bonnie and Clyde's bodies from the Louisiana ambush show significant discrepancies when compared to authenticated images taken during their crime spree. The facial features don't match perfectly, and there are inconsistencies in identifying marks that have never been adequately explained. The suggestion that federal authorities might have killed the wrong people in their eagerness to end the manhunt provided context for why Emma's research had generated such fierce opposition. If her great-uncle's documents contained evidence that Bonnie and Clyde had survived their supposed deaths, it would contradict not only FBI narratives, but the historical record that had been built around their dramatic demise. Emma's phone buzzed with a text message that interrupted the document analysis, its contents making her stomach clench with renewed anxiety about the institutional pressure that continued to mount despite Dr. Chin's professional validation. The message was from Rachel Martinez at Social Services. "Miss Winters, you missed your scheduled appointment this morning. Please contact our office immediately to reschedule your mandatory evaluation. Failure to comply may result in additional interventions." Dr. Chun observed Emma's obvious distress and asked to see the message, her expression hardening as she recognized the coercive language being used to force compliance with psychological evaluation. "Miss Winters, this is harassment disguised as social service, and it's being used to prevent you from pursuing legitimate historical research. I'm going to contact colleagues at the American Civil Liberties Union, who specialize in protecting researchers from institutional abuse. Specialize in protecting researchers from institutional abuse." The prospect of legal support from civil rights organizations provided Emma with hope that the coordinated campaign against her research could be challenged through appropriate channels, rather than forcing her to choose between family financial security and historical investigation. Chun's professional connections gave her access to resources that could counter the institutional pressure being applied to suppress inconvenient historical discoveries. "But first," Dr. Chen said, returning to her analysis of Samuel's letter, "we need to understand exactly what your great-uncle was trying to tell you about the location of this buried money. If his information is accurate, we're looking at one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century." The letter's contents, when subjected to scientific analysis, revealed additional details that hadn't been apparent during Emma's initial reading. Dr. Chun's specialized equipment detected faded writing that had become invisible over time. Words that had been written in pencil so light that they could only be read using enhanced photographic techniques. "Your great-uncle wrote additional notes in the margins," Dr. Chen explained, pointing to text that appeared ghost-like under ultraviolet illumination. "He's provided specific geographic coordinates, references to landmark trees that were marked with symbols, and what appears to be a warning about federal agents who might still be monitoring the area." The additional information transformed Samuel's letter from general family history into precise instructions for locating buried treasure, complete with navigational details that reflected military training in land navigation and site identification. Emma realized that her great-uncle had provided her with far more detailed information than she'd initially understood. "Dr. Chun," Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she absorbed the implications of the scientific analysis. "These documents are genuine, aren't they? My great-uncle really did meet Bonnie Parker, and she really did give him a map to buried money from bank robberies." Margaret Chun looked directly at Emma with the serious expression of someone who'd spent decades evaluating extraordinary claims and understood the responsibility that came with confirming historical discoveries that could challenge established narratives. "Miss Winters, based on scientific analysis of your materials and my knowledge of FBI case files from that period, I believe your great-uncle's account is historically accurate. You're in possession of authentic artifacts that provide evidence of one of the most significant unsolved mysteries in American criminal history." The professional confirmation that Emma's research was based on genuine historical evidence provided validation that made the institutional opposition she'd been facing seem even more outrageous. Local authorities had attempted to destroy her credibility and silence her investigation without conducting the scientific analysis that would have revealed the authenticity of her materials. Emma's parents arrived at the cabin during the afternoon, their faces showing the strain of dealing with social services harassment and community gossip that had made their daily lives increasingly difficult. Marcus and Linda Winters had driven to the cabin expecting to find their daughter engaged in teenage fantasy, but instead discovered a federal historian conducting scientific analysis of documents that appeared to validate Emma's extraordinary claims. "Dr. Chun," Marcus said after Emma had introduced her parents to the federal historian, "our daughter has been under enormous pressure from people who claim she's mentally ill because she takes these family documents seriously. Can you help us understand what's really happening here?" Margaret Chun spent the next hour explaining her analysis results to Emma's parents, her scientific evidence providing context for understanding why their daughter's research had generated such fierce opposition from local authorities. The authentication of Samuel's materials transformed Emma from a delusional teenager into a serious historical researcher whose work threatened established narratives that powerful interests were determined to protect. "Mr. and Mrs. Winters," Dr. Chun concluded, "your daughter has made what may be the most significant historical discovery of the decade. The documents she inherited provide scientific evidence that federal law enforcement agencies made serious errors in the 1930s, errors that have been covered up for nearly 90 years. Linda Winters had been quiet throughout the explanation, but now she spoke with the protective intensity of a mother whose child had been attacked by forces beyond her family's ability to understand or resist. "Dr. Chun, if Emma's research is this important, why are local authorities trying to force her to admit it's fake? Why are they using social SIS to pressure her into psychological evaluation?" The question cut to the heart of the institutional conspiracy that had been mobilized against Emma's research. And Dr. Chun's answer revealed the scope of interests that were threatened by historical discoveries that could embarrass federal agencies and challenge established narratives about Depression-era law enforcement. "Mrs. Winters, your daughter's documents provide evidence that could force federal agencies to acknowledge significant historical errors and potentially reopen criminal cases that were officially closed in 1934. Additionally, wealthy families who were victims of Bonnie and Clyde robberies during the Depression era have descendants who maintain significant political influence and would prefer that these crimes remain historical footnotes rather than active investigations." Marcus Winters processed this information with the methodical approach he brought to mechanical problems, his farmer's pragmatism cutting through the complexity to focus on practical implications for his family's situation. "So Emma's research threatens people with enough money and connections to use government agencies against us. What does that mean for our family's safety and financial security? Dr. Chun's expression grew serious as she recognized the legitimate dangers that Emma's family faced from people who possessed the resources and ruthlessness to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. Mr. Winters, I won't minimize the risks you're facing. The people who are trying to suppress Emma's research have demonstrated that they're willing to use social services, academic institutions, and social media to destroy her credibility and isolate her from potential supporters. The acknowledgement that Emma's family was facing genuine danger from powerful interests provided context for understanding why Samuel Winters had kept his secret for 73 years. The old veteran had apparently understood that some historical truths remained politically sensitive long after the original events had passed into history. However, Dr. Chun continued, Emma's research is too important to be suppressed by people whose only concern is protecting their own interests. If the buried money that your great-uncle described actually exists, its recovery could provide not only financial security for your family, but historical vindication that would expose the institutional corruption being used against you. Suggestion that pursuing the treasure hunt could provide both practical and historical benefits transformed Emma's research from academic exercise into practical necessity. If Samuel's map led to the recovery of stolen bank money, the physical evidence would provide irrefutable proof of his story's authenticity while generating the resources necessary to fight the institutional pressure being applied against her. Family. Emma looked at her parents and saw the mixture of fear and determination that had sustained their family through previous crises. The dairy farm's financial struggles had taught them that sometimes survival required taking calculated risks that more secure families might avoid. Her great-uncle's secret represented the kind of opportunity that could either destroy them completely or provide the resources necessary to fight back against forces that seemed overwhelming. Mom, Dad, Emma said, her voice carrying a maturity that reflected weeks of dealing with adult opposition and institutional pressure. I think we need to find out if Great-Uncle Samuel's map leads to real treasure. It's the only way to prove that his story is true and that the people trying to silence me are protecting lies rather than exposing delusion. Linda Winters reached across the table to take her daughter's hand, her expression reflecting the maternal instinct to protect, combined with recognition that Emma had already been forced to confront dangers that most teenagers never faced. Sweetheart, if we pursue this treasure hunt and it goes wrong, we could lose everything. The farm, our home, maybe even our freedom if these people are as dangerous as Dr. Chun suggests. Marcus nodded agreement with his wife's concerns while simultaneously recognizing that their current situation was already unsustainable. Emma, your mother's right about the risks. But we're already losing everything if the social services pressure continues and the community decides we're the kind of family that raises mentally unstable children. Dr. Chun had been listening to the family discussion with obvious respect for their right to make decisions about their own lives, but now she offered perspective based on her professional experience with similar cases. Mr. and Mrs. Winters, I've seen how institutional pressure campaigns work against families who lack the resources to fight back. If you don't challenge the narrative that's being constructed about Emma's mental health, it will follow her for the rest of her life. The recognition that passive resistance wouldn't protect Emma from long-term consequences of the institutional attack provided clarity about their limited options. The campaign against her credibility had already reached the point where future college applications, employment opportunities, and personal relationships could be affected by official records, suggesting that she'd experienced psychological difficulties requiring professional intervention. Furthermore, Dr. Chun continued, if Emma's research leads to the recovery of stolen money from 1930s bank robberies, the physical evidence would provide irrefutable proof that her documents are authentic. The historical vindication would expose everyone who's been attacking her credibility as either incompetent or corrupt. Emma felt something shift inside her as she recognized that pursuing her great-uncle's treasure hunt wasn't just about family financial security or historical curiosity. It was about defending the truth against institutional forces that were willing to destroy individual lives to protect narratives that served their own interests. "I want to find the money," Emma said, her voice carrying the determination that had sustained her family through generations of adversity. "Not because we need it, though we do, but because Great-Uncle Samuel trusted me with his secret, and these people are trying to destroy us for taking it seriously." Marcus and Linda Winters exchanged the kind of look that passed between couples who'd survived decades of challenges together, their silent communication reaching the same conclusion that their daughter had already articulated. Sometimes fighting back was the only way to preserve dignity and protect family integrity against forces that were determined to crush anyone who threatened their interests. "Then we find the money," Marcus said simply, his farmer's pragmatism accepting the reality that their current situation required extraordinary action to protect their family's future. "We prove that Samuel's story is true. We expose the people who've been attacking Emma, and we secure our family's financial independence, so nobody can ever use poverty against us again." As afternoon shadows lengthened across Whitewater Lake and Dr. Chun prepared to contact federal colleagues who could provide additional support for Emma's research, the Winters family made a commitment that would determine whether Samuel's 73-year-old secret would finally be revealed or remain buried forever, along with the truth about what had really happened to Bonnie and Clyde in the desperate final months of their crime spree. The treasure hunt would begin at dawn. Guided by scientific analysis of authentic historical documents and supported by professional historians whose expertise could counter the institutional pressure that had nearly succeeded in destroying Emma's credibility before her research had been properly evaluated. The pre-dawn darkness of Thursday morning brought with it the kind of bone-deep cold that made October in northern Wisconsin feel like winter's advance warning. But Emma felt none of the chill as she stood beside Dr. Chun's equipment-laden pickup truck, studying the topographical maps that would guide their search for Samuel's buried treasure. The federal historian had spent the night cross-referencing her great-uncle's hand-drawn map with modern satellite imagery and geological surveys, creating a comprehensive search plan that combined Depression-era landmarks with contemporary navigation technology. "The key challenge," Dr. Chun explained while adjusting a handheld GPS unit that would supplement Samuel's geographical references, "is that the landscape has changed significantly over the past 90 years. Some of the trees your great-uncle used as landmarks may have been cut down, streams might have changed course, and development could have altered the terrain in ways that make his directions less reliable." Emma studied the overlay of Samuel's map against current topographical data, noting discrepancies that reflected nearly a century of environmental and human modifications to the area around the Yellow River headwaters. Her great-uncle's careful notations about distinctive rock formations and mature oak trees would need to be reconciled with contemporary reality through systematic ground truthing. That could take days or weeks to complete thoroughly. Dr. Chun had brought additional equipment that reflected her federal experience with archaeological investigations and evidence recovery. Ground-penetrating radar, metal detection systems, and soil analysis tools filled the truck bed alongside camping supplies and documentation materials that would allow them to conduct a professional excavation if they located the burial site described in Samuel's instructions. "Emma," Dr. Chun said, her voice carrying the seriousness of someone who understood the historical significance of their mission, "if we find what your great-uncle described, we're not just recovering stolen money from bank robberies. We're potentially rewriting American criminal history and exposing federal law enforcement errors that have been covered up for nearly 90 years. The weight of historical responsibility added another layer of complexity to Emma's emotional state as she prepared to pursue treasure that could vindicate her family's reputation while simultaneously challenging established narratives about one of the FBI's most famous cases. The personal stakes had evolved beyond financial necessity into a quest for historical truth that could have implications extending far beyond her individual circumstances. Marcus Winters had insisted on accompanying the expedition despite his lack of experience with historical research or treasure hunting. His farmer's knowledge of local geography and practical skills with excavation equipment made him a valuable team member. But Emma recognized that his primary motivation was paternal protectiveness rather than intellectual curiosity about Depression-era criminal history. "Dad," Emma said as her father loaded additional digging tools into Dr. Chun's truck, "you don't have to come with us. This could be dangerous if we're right about the kind of opposition we're facing." Marcus paused in his work to look directly at his daughter, his expression carrying the stubborn determination that had sustained their family through decades of agricultural challenges and financial uncertainty. "Emma, honey, I've been fighting to keep this farm running for 23 years against banks, weather, equipment failures, and market forces that were designed to crush independent operations. I'm not going to let some wealthy bullies destroy my daughter's future because she had the courage to take her family's history seriously." The paternal support provided Emma with emotional strength that she hadn't realized she needed as the reality of their undertaking became more apparent. Pursuing Samuel's treasure wasn't just a historical investigation. It was a direct challenge to powerful interests that had already demonstrated their willingness to use institutional authority to suppress inconvenient discoveries. Dr. Chun's phone rang with an incoming call that interrupted their preparation. The caller ID showing a Washington, D.C. area code that suggested federal involvement in their situation. Emma watched the historian's expression shift from professional interest to obvious concern as she listened to information that was clearly significant, but not immediately shared with her companions. That was Dr. James Morrison from the Smithsonian Institution, Dr. Chun said after ending the call, her voice tight with implications that she seemed reluctant to articulate fully. "He's been contacted by federal agents who expressed concerns about historical research being conducted in this area. The FBI is apparently aware of our investigation and has questions about the materials we're analyzing." The revelation that federal law enforcement was monitoring their treasure hunt provided confirmation that Emma's documents possessed the kind of historical significance that could embarrass governmental institutions whose reputations depended on maintaining established narratives about past investigations. Dr. Chen's federal contacts had apparently triggered official attention that could complicate their search efforts. "What kind of questions?" Emma asked, though she suspected that FBI interest in their research was more likely related to covering up historical mistakes than ensuring academic accuracy. Dr. Chun was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing how much information to share about federal concerns that might still be classified or politically sensitive. "Miss Winters, the FBI is claiming that your documents might be connected to ongoing national security investigations related to unsolved criminal cases from the 1930s. They've requested that we suspend our research until federal authorities can evaluate the materials for potential security implications." The suggestion that Depression-era bank robbery evidence could pose contemporary national security threats seemed transparently absurd, but Emma recognized that federal agencies possessed the authority to halt their investigation regardless of the legitimacy of their stated concerns. The institutional power that had been mobilized against her research was apparently more extensive than even Dr. Chin had initially understood. "Security implications?" Marcus asked, his farmer's skepticism cutting through bureaucratic language to focus on practical realities. What security threat could possibly come from 90-year-old bank robbery evidence? Dr. Chun's federal experience had apparently taught her to recognize the difference between legitimate security concerns and institutional efforts to suppress embarrassing historical discoveries. "Mr. Winters, the FBI is probably concerned that Your daughter's research could force them to acknowledge significant errors in one of their most famous cases. Admitting that they might have killed innocent people in 1934 while allowing Bonnie and Clyde to escape would be a public relations disaster that could undermine confidence in federal law enforcement. The acknowledgement that institutional self-interest, rather than national security, was driving federal opposition to their research provided clarity about the scope of resistance they were facing. Emma's treasure hunt threatened not just local business interests, but federal agencies, whose historical reputations depended on maintaining narratives that her great-uncle's documents could definitively contradict. Their preparation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 additional vehicles, neither of which belonged to people Emma recognized as allies in her fight against institutional suppression. The first was another black SUV, similar to the one Harrison Blackwood had used during his initial intimidation attempt, while the second appeared to be an unmarked government sedan that suggested official rather than private opposition to their activities. Dr. Chun observed the approaching vehicles with obvious concern, her federal experience having taught her to recognize the kind of coordinated response that indicated serious institutional interest in their research. Miss Winters, I think we need to consider the possibility that our investigation has attracted more attention than we're prepared to handle through normal academic channels. Emma felt the familiar dread that had accompanied every confrontation with people whose resources and connections made them dangerous opponents for a farming family that lacked political influence or financial resources to fight back against institutional pressure. The arrival of what appeared to be federal agents suggested that her treasure hunt had escalated beyond local business concerns into matters that could have national implications. Harrison Blackwood emerged from the SUV, accompanied by Derek Castellano and 2 men in suits whose bearing and demeanor suggested law enforcement or federal agency backgrounds. The government sedan yielded 3 additional individuals whose credentials and authority were not immediately apparent, but whose professional appearance indicated serious official involvement in whatever intervention was about to occur. Miss Winters, Harrison Blackwood called out with the theatrical authority of someone who believed he held all the advantages in the confrontation that was about to unfold. I think it's time we had a more comprehensive discussion about the legal and security implications of your treasure hunting activities. Emma stepped closer to Dr. Chun, drawing strength from the federal historian's professional expertise and institutional connections while recognizing that they were about to face opposition that exceeded anything they'd previously encountered. The coordinated arrival of multiple agencies suggested that her research had triggered responses from authorities whose power to intervene extended far beyond local social services or academic institutions. One of the federal agents approached Dr. Chun with the kind of professional courtesy that acknowledged her credentials while making clear that her involvement in Emma's research was now a matter of official concern. Dr. Chun, I'm Agent Sarah Coleman with the FBI's Historical Case Review Division. We need to discuss some materials that you've been analyzing in connection with Depression-era criminal investigations. The existence of an FBI division dedicated to historical case review provided confirmation that federal agencies maintained ongoing interest in criminal cases that most people assumed had been closed decades ago. Agent Coleman's professional approach suggested that Dr. Chun's involvement had elevated Emma's research from local curiosity to federal investigation requiring official response. Agent Coleman, Dr. Chun replied with the diplomatic tone of someone whose federal experience had taught her to navigate jurisdictional complexities without unnecessarily antagonizing colleagues. I'm conducting legitimate historical research based on materials inherited by Miss Winters from her deceased relative. The documents have been scientifically authenticated and appear to contain significant information about unsolved aspects of 1930s criminal cases. Agent Coleman consulted a tablet that apparently contained detailed information about their investigation. her access to comprehensive data suggesting that federal authorities had been monitoring Emma's research more extensively than anyone had realized. Dr. Chun, we're aware of your authentication results, and we appreciate your professional approach to evaluating these materials. However, the documents in question may be connected to ongoing federal investigations that require specialized handling. The claim that 90-year-old documents remained connected to ongoing federal investigations seemed designed to provide legal justification for seizing Emma's materials and ending her research rather than reflecting legitimate contemporary security concerns. Emma recognized that she was witnessing the same institutional manipulation that had been used against her at the local level, but now applied with federal authority that was much more difficult to challenge or resist. What ongoing investigations? Emma asked, her voice carrying the determined skepticism that had sustained her through weeks of institutional pressure designed to make her abandon her research. These documents are about events that happened in 1934. Everyone involved has been dead for decades. Agent Coleman's response revealed the sophistication of federal arguments that had been prepared to justify intervention in Emma's research. Miss Winters, certain aspects of Depression-era criminal cases remain classified due to their connection to intelligence operations and federal law enforcement techniques that could still be sensitive if disclosed publicly. Your materials may contain information that falls under those classification restrictions. The suggestion that Samuel's documents contained classified intelligence information seemed transparently designed to provide legal cover for federal seizure of materials that could embarrass the FBI by revealing historical mistakes. Emma realized that she was facing the same institutional pressure that had been applied at the local level, but now backed by federal authority that possessed far greater resources for suppressing inconvenient historical discoveries. Dr. Chun stepped forward with the professional authority of someone whose federal background gave her credibility that local opponents couldn't easily dismiss or intimidate. Agent Coleman, classification restrictions cannot be applied retroactively to historical materials that were never part of official federal investigations. Miss Winters' documents were created by private individuals and have been held by family members for nearly 90 years without any federal involvement. The legal challenge to federal authority was delivered with the kind of expertise that came from decades of working within government systems. But Emma could see that Agent Coleman was prepared to counter academic arguments with institutional power that didn't depend on legal precision or historical accuracy. Dr. Chun, Agent Coleman replied, federal authorities have broad discretion to evaluate materials that may affect national security, regardless of their historical origins or current ownership status. We're requesting voluntary cooperation with our investigation, but we have legal authority to secure these materials if necessary. The threat of federal seizure was delivered with diplomatic language that obscured its coercive nature, but Emma understood that she was being given an ankokikung ultimatum similar to Harrison Blackwood's earlier offer of financial assistance in exchange for abandoning her research. Federal agencies were apparently willing to use their authority to suppress historical discoveries that could challenge established narratives about past investigations. Marcus Winters had been listening to the exchange with growing anger at seeing his daughter threatened by federal agents whose authority was being used to protect institutional interests rather than serve justice or historical accuracy. Agent Coleman, are you seriously telling us that the FBI is going to steal historical documents from a teenager because they might prove that federal agents made mistakes 90 years ago? The directness of Marcus's challenge cut through the diplomatic language that had characterized the confrontation, forcing Agent Coleman to acknowledge the real purpose of federal intervention in Emma's research. Her response revealed the institutional priorities that drove contemporary federal interest in Depression-era criminal cases. Mr. Winters, we're not stealing anything. We're requesting cooperation with a federal investigation that could affect national security interests. Miss Winter's materials need to be evaluated by qualified federal experts who can determine their significance and appropriate handling. Emma felt the weight of federal authority being applied to suppress her research, but she also felt the stubborn determination that had sustained her family through decades of challenges that had seemed overwhelming at the time they were faced. Her great-uncle had kept his secret for 73 years while waiting for someone brave enough to pursue the truth regardless of institutional opposition. "Agent Coleman," Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she recognized that backing down would mean abandoning not just her research but her great-uncle's trust and her family's integrity. "These documents belong to me, and I have every right to research my family's history using materials that I inherited legally. If federal agencies want to evaluate them, they can do so through proper academic channels rather than trying to intimidate me into giving up my rights." The defiance of federal authority was delivered with the kind of principled determination that had made her great-uncle willing to keep dangerous secrets rather than betray people who had trusted him with their lives. Emma realized that she was facing the same choice Samuel had confronted in 1934, protecting truth or submitting to institutional pressure designed to suppress inconvenient historical discoveries. As morning sunlight began filtering through the pine trees that surrounded the cabin, Emma understood that her treasure hunt had evolved from family, financial necessity into a battle for historical truth that would determine whether Samuel's 73-year vigil had been maintained by someone worthy of his trust, or whether the institutional forces that had tried to destroy her credibility would succeed in burying the truth along with whatever treasures might be hidden in the Wisconsin wilderness. The standoff between federal authority and family determination lasted exactly 11 minutes before Dr. Chun's phone rang with a call that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of their confrontation. The caller was Dr. Patricia Hendricks from the National Archives, whose voice carried the kind of professional urgency that suggested significant developments in the federal investigation of Emma's materials. "Margaret," Dr. Hendricks said loudly, "enough for others to hear. You need to know that we've been conducting our own analysis of FBI case files related to the Bonnie and Clyde investigation. What we've found corroborates the young woman's claims and suggests that federal agents have been suppressing evidence of their mistakes for nearly 90 years. Agent Coleman's expression shifted from confident authority to obvious concern as she realized that Emma's research was receiving support from federal historians whose credentials and institutional access made them difficult to dismiss or intimidate. The National Archives possessed FBI documents that could either validate or contradict the claims being made about ongoing security concerns related to Depression-era criminal cases. Dr. Cheen activated her phone speaker function so that everyone present could hear the conversation that was about to expose the real reasons behind federal opposition to Emma's treasure hunt. "Pat, what exactly did you find in the FBI files that relates to Miss Winter's materials?" Dr. Hendricks' response revealed information that transformed Emma's family research from curious historical anomaly into evidence of federal law enforcement failures that had been covered up through institutional secrecy and document classification. "Margaret, the FBI's own internal memos from 1934 and 1935 indicate that field agents had serious doubts about whether they'd killed the right people in the Louisiana ambush. Several agents filed reports suggesting that the bodies didn't match known physical descriptions of Bonnie and Clyde, but those reports were suppressed by J. Edgar Hoover's office. The revelation that FBI agents had questioned the official narrative while their concerns were being institutionally suppressed provided documentary evidence that Emma's great-uncle's claims about Bonnie and Clyde surviving their supposed deaths might be historically accurate. Agent Coleman's attempt to classify Emma's materials as security threats was being undermined by the Bureau's own historical records. Furthermore, Dr. Hendricks continued, We found evidence that federal agents continued investigating possible Bonnie and Clyde sightings throughout 1934 and 1935, including reports of contacts with civilians in Wisconsin and Minnesota. The Thinsey investigations were terminated, not because the leads were proven false, but because the Bureau wanted to maintain the narrative that the case had been successfully closed. Emma felt vindication flooding through her as federal historians confirmed that her research was based on authentic historical possibilities rather than family fantasy. The institutional pressure that had been applied to suppress her investigation was apparently designed to protect federal agencies from embarrassment, rather than ensure national security or historical accuracy. Agent Coleman had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort as she realized that her authority to classify Emma's materials was being challenged by federal historians whose access to FBI archives provided them with information that contradicted the security justifications she'd been instructed to use. "Dr. Hendricks," Agent Coleman said, her voice tight with the frustration of someone whose institutional authority was being systematically undermined by colleagues with superior expertise and documentation. "Those files remain classified under federal law enforcement privilege, and their contents cannot be discussed in public forums without appropriate security clearance." Dr. Hendricks' laugh carried the confidence of someone whose federal credentials and institutional knowledge made her immune to intimidation from agents whose authority depended on maintaining narratives that historical evidence could contradict. "Agent Coleman, I've held federal security clearance for 37 years, and I can tell you definitively that there are no legitimate national security concerns related to Depression-era bank robbery cases. The classification of these materials is designed to protect institutional reputation rather than national interests." The professional confrontation between federal historians and law enforcement agents was providing Emma with a real-time education in how institutional power functioned when different agencies possessed conflicting interests in the same historical evidence. Dr. Hendricks' access to classified FBI files gave her the authority to challenge Agent Coleman's claims about ongoing security implications. Harrison Blackwood had been observing the federal confrontation with obvious calculation, apparently recognizing that his local influence was irrelevant when federal agencies were involved in disputes about national security classification and historical accuracy. His attempt to control Emma's research through financial pressure and social intimidation had evolved into a situation that required federal resolution beyond his ability to influence or manipulate. "Agent Coleman," Harrison Blackwood said, his voice carrying the practiced deference that wealthy business owners used when dealing with federal authority, "perhaps we should allow Miss Winters to pursue her historical research while ensuring that any discoveries are properly documented and evaluated by appropriate federal experts." The suggestion represented a strategic retreat from his earlier position that Emma's research should be completely suppressed, but Emma recognized that Blackwood was simply adapting his approach to changed circumstances rather than genuinely supporting her right to investigate her family's history. His primary concern remained protecting property values and tourism revenue from any historical discoveries that might associate the area with criminal activity. Dr. Chin seized the opening that the federal confrontation had created, her professional expertise providing her with the credibility necessary to challenge both local business interests and federal agency overreach. "Agent Coleman, Miss Winters has every right to pursue legitimate historical research based on inherited family documents. If federal agencies want to evaluate her findings, they can do so through proper academic channels after she's completed her investigation." The assertion of Emma's civil rights was delivered with the authority of someone whose federal background made her qualified to navigate jurisdictional disputes between different governmental interests. Dr. Chun's support provided Emma with professional protection against institutional pressure that had previously seemed overwhelming and impossible to resist. Emma felt a surge of determination that had been building throughout weeks of opposition from people who possessed greater resources and institutional authority, but lacked the moral right to suppress historical truth. Her great-uncle had trusted her with secrets that he'd protected for 73 years, and she wasn't going to abandon that trust because federal agents and wealthy business owners found her research inconvenient. "I'm going to find the treasure that my great-uncle described," Emma announced, her voice carrying the stubborn resolve that had sustained her family through generations of adversity. "If federal agencies want to observe or participate, they're welcome to do so through proper channels. But I'm not going to be intimidated into abandoning legitimate historical research because it might embarrass people who made mistakes 90 years ago." Marcus Winters stepped closer to his daughter, his physical presence reinforcing her declaration of independence from institutional pressure that had been designed to crush her spirit and force her compliance with narratives that served other people's interests rather than historical accuracy. "Agent Coleman," Marcus said, his farmer's pragmatism cutting through bureaucratic complexity to focus on fundamental issues of fairness and constitutional rights. "My daughter has broken no laws, threatened no one, and conducted herself with more integrity than the federal agents and wealthy businessmen who've been trying to destroy her reputation. If you want to stop her from researching her family's history, you'll need to explain to a federal judge why the FBI is suppressing historical investigation that could expose your agency's mistakes." The challenge to federal authority was delivered with the kind of principled defiance that American farmers had used against governmental overreach throughout the nation's history. Marcus Winters was prepared to fight federal agencies in court rather than allow them to suppress his daughter's research through intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. Agent Coleman consulted her tablet and appeared to be receiving instructions from superiors who were apparently reassessing their approach to Emma's investigation in light of support from federal historians and the threat of legal challenges that could force public disclosure of classified materials. Her expression suggested that federal authorities were discovering that suppressing Emma's research was more complicated than they'd initially anticipated. "Miss Winters," Agent Coleman said finally, her tone suggesting compromise rather than continued confrontation, "federal authorities are prepared to allow your research to continue under certain conditions. We require that any discoveries be immediately reported to appropriate federal agencies, and we reserve the right to classify materials that pose legitimate security concerns." The conditional permission represented a significant retreat from the federal agency's initial demand for immediate suppression of Emma's research. But Emma recognized that accepting their terms would give federal authorities veto power over any discoveries that might prove embarrassing to institutional interests. "Agent Coleman," Emma replied, her voice carrying confidence that came from professional support and family backing, "I'll report any discoveries to appropriate academic institutions that can evaluate their historical significance. Federal agencies can participate in that process through normal scholarly channels, but I won't give you authority to suppress legitimate historical findings." The negotiation between a teenage treasure hunter and federal law enforcement was being conducted with the kind of diplomatic precision that reflected the serious implications of Emma's research for institutional reputations and historical narratives that had been accepted as fact for nearly 9 decades. Dr. Chun stepped forward with a proposal that could satisfy both Emma's right to conduct historical research and federal concerns about proper handling of sensitive materials. "Agent Coleman, I propose that Miss Winters' investigation proceed under academic supervision, with findings evaluated by a panel of qualified historians before any public disclosure. This approach protects both historical accuracy and legitimate federal interests." The compromise offered professional oversight that could prevent Emma's research from being sensationalized, while ensuring that any discoveries received proper scholarly evaluation rather than being buried by federal agencies. whose primary concern was protecting institutional reputation rather than advancing historical knowledge. Agent Coleman spent several minutes consulting with her colleagues and apparently receiving guidance from federal supervisors who were making real-time decisions about how to handle a situation that had evolved beyond their initial expectations. Emma watched the federal agents conduct their conference with growing recognition that her research had forced governmental institutions to confront historical errors that they'd hoped would remain buried forever. "Miss Winters," Agent Coleman said after completing her consultations, "federal authorities are prepared to accept Dr. Chun's proposal for academic supervision of your research. However, we want to make clear that federal law enforcement maintains jurisdiction over any criminal evidence that might be discovered during your investigation." The acknowledgement that Emma's treasure hunt might uncover genuine criminal evidence provided official validation that her research was based on legitimate historical possibilities rather than family fantasy. Federal agents were apparently taking seriously the possibility that Samuel's map might lead to the recovery of stolen money from 1930s bank robberies. Emma looked at Dr. Chun and her father, both of whom nodded their approval of the compromise. That would allow her investigation to continue while providing professional oversight that could protect her from accusations of irresponsible treasure hunting or historical sensationalism. "I accept those conditions," Emma said, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd successfully defended her rights against institutional pressure that had seemed overwhelming just hours earlier. "Dr. Chun will supervise my research and will follow proper academic protocols for evaluating and reporting any discoveries." Harrison Blackwood and his associates had been observing the federal negotiations with obvious frustration as they realized that their local influence was irrelevant when Emma's research had federal protection and academic supervision. Their attempt to suppress her investigation through social pressure and institutional intimidation had been countered by professional historians whose expertise and credentials made them immune to local political manipulation. As the federal agents prepared to leave, and Harrison Blackwood's group reluctantly accepted that Emma's treasure hunt would proceed despite their opposition, Emma felt the kind of triumph that came from defending principle against superior force. Her great-uncle's 73-year vigil was about to be vindicated by someone who'd inherited his courage along with his secrets. Dr. Chun began organizing the equipment that would guide their search for Samuel's buried treasure, her professional excitement obvious as she prepared to participate in what might be one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century. The federal confrontation had transformed Emma's family research into an officially sanctioned archaeological investigation with the potential to rewrite American criminal history. "Emma," Dr. Chun said as they loaded the truck with metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and excavation tools, "your great-uncle would be proud to see that his trust was placed in someone brave enough to honor his memory despite opposition from people who valued their own interests more than historical truth." As morning sunlight burned through the autumn mist that rose from Whitewater Lake, Emma realized that her transformation from ridiculed farm girl to serious historical researcher was complete. The institutional forces that had tried to destroy her credibility had been defeated by professional competence, family support, and the stubborn determination to pursue truth regardless of the obstacles placed in her path. The treasure hunt that would either vindicate Samuel's claims or provide final closure to her family's longest-held secret was about to begin. Guided by scientific methodology and protected by federal oversight that would ensure her discoveries received proper evaluation rather than institutional suppression, the Yellow River headwaters yielded their secrets at dawn. Emma, Dr. Chun, and Marcus followed the map to a massive oak marked with a faded $sign. The ground-penetrating radar revealed a metallic mass 6 feet below. As they dug, Harrison Blackwood arrived with local news crews, clearly hoping to capture Emma's failure. Instead, cameras rolled as they unearthed a rusted metal box Inside lay $3.2 million in Depression-era bills, preserved in oilcloth. But the true treasure was beneath the money, a leather journal with Bonnie Parker's elegant handwriting, and photographs documenting their Wisconsin life until 1948. They lived quietly, Emma told reporters. Bonnie became a schoolteacher. Clyde worked as a mechanic. They found redemption. The discovery made national headlines. The Smithsonian featured the collection in a special exhibition, The Secret Lives of American Outlaws. Dr. Chun's academic paper, co-authored with Emma, rewrote criminal history books. Harrison, Blackwood's properties became popular with tourists fascinated by the Bonnie and Clyde connection, ironically boosting local revenue. The FBI formally acknowledged their 1934 mistake. Through declassified documents, the Winters family used their portion of the historical find to save their farm and establish a scholarship fund for rural students interested in historical research. Emma enrolled at the University of Wisconsin to study forensic history. Most importantly, Emma fulfilled her great-uncle's wish. The truth was finally known. As she stood by Samuel's grave, placing wildflowers beside his headstone, Emma whispered, "You were right to wait for someone who would listen." Did you enjoy this journey into hidden history? Stories like Emma's remind us that sometimes truth lies buried beneath official narratives, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. For more tales of historical mysteries, forgotten secrets, and ordinary heroes who changed history, subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell to join us on our next adventure into the past.